India and China, two rivals, two Asian giants who are always thirsty for each other's blood. But here is a twist. The two Asian giants are now coming together to fight off EU's bullying. For quite some time now, EU has been contemplating the idea of carbon tax. EU has been behaving like a wild fox. Very clever. Through this tax, EU wants to shift its share of climate burden on nations like India and China. And that's why India and China are roaring back like Asian tigers. Let's understand first what is EU's carbon tax or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism or CBAM. This carbon tax will not be directly imposed on developing nations but on EU's own importers. Under Phase 1, which went into effect on October 1st, all EU importers will need to report carbon emissions of their goods to the EU, whatever they are importing. 2 or 3 years down the line, Phase 2 will be activated. Under Phase 2, EU will start imposing tax, or we can say start punishing EU importers for importing goods from developing nations. The higher the carbon emission of the product, the higher the taxes. This will automatically discourage EU importers from importing, and they will start sourcing their goods from local manufacturers to avoid paying the tax. This will also add to the costs of goods such as steel and aluminium, which will make the imported goods expensive and local goods cheaper. Now, China has been vocal in its opposition to the EU's carbon tax. The China Iron and Steel Association or CISA labeled it as a new trade barrier. They argue that the tax fails to consider varying development phases. Standards cannot be the same in developed and developing countries. Similarly, India also disapproves of the EU's carbon tax, citing potential harm to its exports. India's Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal describes it as ill-conceived and believes that the EU will eventually realize its flaws. To bypass the EU's new trade barrier, India is also formulating a new plan. New Delhi is planning to implement a domestic tax plan quite similar to the EU's tax regime. India will impose taxes on exporters to the EU and use that revenue on the same exporters to help them transition to green energy. This will eventually render the EU's tax plan futile. Both India and China are exploring measures to protect their domestic producers from the impact of the carbon tax. India is considering a domestic tax, while China is going the other way. It has issued warnings that it will also erect trading barriers in order to teach EU exporters a hard lesson. India is also willing to lock horns with the EU if it is forced into doing so. India has declared it is taking up the matter with the WTO. Minister Goyal last week said, "We are taking carbon tax up with the EU and at the WTO very seriously. India will not be accepting any unfair levies and taxes. India is working and fighting for a fair deal." As India and China unite against the EU's carbon tax diktat, it remains to be seen how this battle will unfold. Will their collective opposition result in a reconsideration of the tax or lead to further tensions? That's all for today. Subscribe to Outright for more such insights. See you in the next video.